I'd like to welcome you again to another Sunday afternoon class from the BYU Library Family History Center. Today, we're going to talk about the guide to how the FamilySearch family tree really works. I've kind of taken this attitude towards what happens on the tree because what I see is people are kind of overwhelmed a little bit with the program, but primarily, it seems to be quite simple. You add names, you fill in the blanks, and basically that's the program. But what we really need to know is how the program uh, how it really understands and how it's supposed to keep this information that we're all posting to, or many of us are posting to the FamilySearch family tree. So this isn't the probably isn't going to follow any kind of step-by-step instructions that you've ever had in learning about the FamilySearch family tree. It's going to be a kind of a different way of looking at the information that gives you a little bit more understanding. The fundamental issue or fundamental concept of the FamilySearch.org family tree is that it was designed to be source-centric. Now, source-centric is kind of a jargon term, but what that means is that the entries in the tree were intended to be supported by sources. And we're using the term source in two different categories, two different ways. The source, as we're used with the FamilySearch family tree, is a record, a historical record or document that supports a particular entry in the FamilySearch family tree. The source also can be, other than that, it can just be a source of the person or the place or whatever happens. But using the term that we're using here is that as we enter information into the FamilySearch family tree, we're going to be looking at the process of substantiating those entries by individual entries on records that we have gathered from the vast number of records out there in the world. First of all, let's look at an entry from the FamilySearch family tree. Most of my examples will be people who show up on my FamilySearch portion of the FamilySearch family tree. Now, you'll notice I say my portion of the tree. It's not my family tree, it's everybody's family tree. It's a collaborative project, and it's based on the fact that everyone can view everything else about all the dead people on the FamilySearch family tree. The rule here, of course, is that if you don't want it online, don't put it, you don't want it well known or known, don't put it online, because putting things online is per se a revelation of that information to the world. So you're probably, there's some ways, of course, where information is not included. For instance, the information about living people on the FamilySearch family tree is not available to others than the actual living person who entered that information. Now, recently they've created a FamilySearch family group, a family tree group, which allows living people to share information between living people. That's another subject, another topic, but that allows people to have their core people of able to see each other, which is to some people is an advantage. But what we're seeing here is a record that has substantial documentation or sources attached, and that is 61 sources. The object here is that for every entry in the family tree, should be supported by a source, by a citation to a record, some kind of a source that says, I got this because I knew my mother and I knew when she was born, and things like that. But in basic, if information is entered without having a source, then from the standpoint of the operation of the family tree, that information simply is fantasy or whatever you want to call it. It's not information that those of us who are understanding the source-centric nature are going to put much. We're not going to believe that information is correct, and we'll automatically assume that the information is not correct. So the problem with having information without a source is that other people will automatically assume that what you've entered is not correct. And that's whether it is or not. Whether you believe it is, whether you think it is, isn't really any kind of way that the actual tree works. So here's, for example, the question in this particular is, which sources do we have for his name? And if you click on name or birth or any of the record entries on FamilySearch now, it will show you this editing field, but it also lists each of the records that are in the already entered into the family tree that support that particular conclusion. So they support the fact that Samuel Shepherd was spelled Samuel's with Samuel Shepherd, and that he appears in this list of records. Now, the way the world works is that you approach this kind of a list with a degree of skepticism. And the only way you can personally determine whether or not this information is correct is to go through and click on each one of these sources and see if that's consistent and you understand and it actually is the correct person. It's not unusual that in going through a list of sources like this, that I personally will find sources that do not pertain to this particular individual. It's just somebody with the same name or something that isn't even related to the individual at all. Now, this is going to be the theme of how this works, and I'm going to work through that in some detail so that we can understand the whole process. So when you're working on the FamilySearch family tree, you add people when you have a source, meaning a record, historical record, that supports the person, and that person's, meaning supporting the person means the existence of the person and that person's relationship to someone already in the family tree. So you don't just add names and then assume you'll find sources someday. That usually ends up with incorrect information. It also happens that a lot of times, as they go back, a discussion today that I had earlier was someone pointing out that they were finding at the BYU students are coming in. By the way, the BYU students who are starting this year at Brigham Young University as freshmen are going to be required to take a 2-hour class requirement that orients them to the school, but one of the orientations that's possible is a project that deals with family history. And so we're going to be getting a few, probably many out of the thousands of new freshmen at BYU working on their family history for the first time. So it's going to be a process of helping a lot of people understand how this process proceeds. So the idea here is that before you start entering this information, you should already have a record that gives the information that you're entering. And the answer is, if you don't know it, leave it blank. And there are ways in genealogy that you can do estimates. We estimate marriage 20 years before, 20 when the couple are 20 years old, and vary that depending on the countries and traditions and everything. We'll also look like a child born every 2 years in a large family, things like that. But those are usually entered with the word about, which means that we've guessed at it. And so that's possible. That's possible to put in. Sometimes helpful in doing research because it helps the computer to find additional records. Of course, you can start adding people to the FamilySearch family tree from your immediate ancestors, meaning your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, ancestors that you knew while they were alive. But once you get to the end of your personal memories, you need to start looking for records of the people. It's not that your memory is bad or whatever, but dates and places and times that people lived and what they did and how they spelled their names and things like that are all things that we're looking for to be verified in historical records that are of all different kinds, of thousands of different kinds of records spread across the world. So if I were to looking at that as the people that I knew personally, they would be first, of course, my parents, and then my paternal grandparents, and one of my great-grandparents. Now, the other people in this immediate part of the family tree were people who died before I was born. And so I had no contact with these people whatsoever. Now, basically, that means that I needed to do research on my grandfather and upon my grandmother on my paternal side. And in doing that, I actually was able to verify some of the dates and adjust some dates that were not necessarily correctly recorded. So relying on just whatever was handed down or information that you got from your own grandmother or your great-grandmother or somebody is not a good idea without doing the checking as you add that information. So the process that I would suggest here, and this is what I did, and I would not suggest that anybody else do anything else, is that I started with myself and I then added information as I obtained records. So the more information, the more records I found, I was able to add more information. Now, I wasn't the only person. Once the FamilySearch family tree came into existence, I have thousands and tens of thousands of relatives. And I was obviously not the only person adding information to this set of grandparents, since these were rather large families. And so these large families had a lot of people who were also adding information. Some of that was added without any sources, and some of it was added with very good sources. And it was a process of what we might call cleaning up the data to make sure that the information was consistent with the records that we were discovering about these different people. So wait a minute, but your memory might be wrong. Find source records for all the people, including all the children, and you might be surprised. I think that's really what it comes down to with me, is that as having a many, many years, 39 years as a trial attorney, I think I have a high degree of skepticism for what you call oral testimony without any kind of evidentiary backing. So for me, it was important that from a legal standpoint, to have every fact substantiated by some evidence, something that could, either testimony or documentary evidence. And that's the same thing we're working here. We're just simply saying that we're working under that same kind of assumption, that we want to make sure that this information is correct, no matter how much you believe it is and how many years you've been celebrating somebody's birthday. So every time you move back a generation, you have to have a supporting source for a parent-child relationship. This is how the family tree works. So I put in my father, and I would need to have some record that showed that he was the son of Leroy Parkinson Tanner, who was my grandfather. And so the question would be, what kind of record do I need? And the answer is maybe 100 different kinds of records can show that family parent-child relationship, everything from census records to draft records to veterans records to Social Security records. And I'm talking primarily about United States. And in every country, there's records that show those kind of relationships that people have always had to tell who their parents were for some purpose, registering for school, joining an organization, being drafted into the army, lots of places where you have to know that. One thing you find interesting here is that the birthplace comes out to be in French. So it's kind of interesting that that's true, but it's correct, but it just happens to be French. And so that was kind of an interesting thing. Actually, it's not correct. So I'll probably have to go back and correct that because it looks like somebody's standardized it to Joseph City. Oh, he was born in 1895, so it couldn't be Joseph City. It had to be St. Joseph back then. Okay, so there's some things like that. There's technicalities and there's all sorts of things. Now, one of the things that people do, and that's kind of an overriding issue with the FamilySearch family tree, is that people can change this record. So somebody stuck a birthplace in French. I may want to change it to English, and I may want to correct it now that I've looked at it. And so the answer is yes, I can go in and correct it. I would use the analogy of a garden. If you plant a garden, you can count on the fact that you're going to get some weeds unless you put it in sort of a hydroponic garden without any possible contact, except I think even in those, it's possible to get some kinds of problems. But weeding a garden is a good analogy, and the family tree is like a garden. It's going to grow weeds. And from time to time, you're going to have to go in and pull those weeds out and change the information that's been entered. But over here, you can see there's, in this case, a substantial number of sources that supports the fact that Leroy Parkinson Tanner, was the person. So another analogy here is that I think anyone has even kind of a rudimentary appreciation or understanding of the Bible has heard the story about the house built on sand and the house built on the rock. Extending a pedigree without sources supporting each parent-child relationship is like building a house on the sand. It's just going to fall down. It just isn't substantial and it's not going to last. So the interesting thing about the FamilySearch, and this is just sort of an extension of it, is that there are many pedigrees that go back to royalty. There's many pedigrees that go back past royalty, and there's a few pedigrees on family tree that go back, or quite a number that go back to Adam kinds of things. In those pedigrees, it's almost 100%. It's 100% at some point, but at some point there's 100% not possibility, but fact that the pedigree ends before it ever goes back any further. So you just have to learn and understand that principle. So this is my family tree, a spreadsheet showing without any living people showing. This is the dead people. And you can say, well, my family tree is nothing like that. And there's no, what is it? But what you've got to understand about this family tree is that each of these entries on this fan chart here is supported by a record showing a parent-child relationship. So if I go back on any line, like I go back on Jessie Christensen, my grandmother, then her father and her grandfather, and so forth and so forth, that information is now substantiated by records. And one interesting part, of course, on this family tree from our perspective as a family is that in the lower right corner, when you see a second generation or third generation, fourth generation Marinus Christensen, we didn't know who his birth parents were because he was adopted, and we only determined that through a combination of research and DNA. So this line, the Anton, Mark Vardson, and so forth, is a new line for us and just been filled in. So those are the kinds of things that we're looking for, and we're using as substantiation. But rather than saying, this is the goal is whatever your family has established and what is actually the reality of the records with regards to your family. And I want to emphasize that when you're looking at this, you're not looking at anything I did personally. You're looking at what people did over the last 100+ years of doing research. And people back as far as the fourth and fifth generation out there were alive when they started doing the research for this tree. So it was a lot easier to come up with this information when they were already alive. So what happens when we leave this comfortable circle of ancestors and we go past any of these people? So I'm going to highlight this group up here. There you can see, I know it's hard to see on these, might be too small, but from John Hamilton Morgan, you see a Gerard Morgan and a Gerard Morgan and a Gerard Morgan. And there's the three Gerards, and have been numbered 1 through 3, but obviously they didn't number themselves 1 through 3. So now we're going to kind of look at these people. So Gerard Morgan is the last person on the Morgan line at 7 generations on that fan chart. And so looking at Gerard Morgan, he was married in October 1772. He was born in 1755. And he died in 1786. He wasn't very old when he died, actually. And his father, as it shows on the FamilySearch family tree, is someone named Dr. John Morgan, and his mother is someone named Mary Woodson. So let's kind of look at how this works out. So what we have here, and if we look at the sources that are added to Gerard Morgan. And this is the process when I emphasize the fact that what we're doing here is we're looking at a process of a way to examine the information and determine whether or not there's any kind of believability or source support for the information that we've already have in the family tree. So I'm pulling this up and looking at Gerard Morgan, and I'm seeing that there are 5 sources. And there's one for Virginia births and christenings. There's a name and a date from what's called the Douglas Register. There's another Virginia births and christenings, Douglas Register, and then there's a life and ministry of John Morgan. Now, if I were to go through the process, which I'm suggesting, which I can't do during time constraints of this presentation, is that I would be looking at each one of those to see if any of those mention who his father is or his mother is. In other words, is there something in one of these records that ties him to the next generation? And the answer is none of these sources show a parent-child relationship. So Gerard Morgan has no record that shows who his parents are. So whoever wrote those parents in has just made that up as far as the tree is concerned, as far as the FamilySearch family tree is concerned. It's not supported by any source. There's no record that shows who Gerard Morgan's parents were. And that doesn't mean the record doesn't exist someplace. That doesn't mean that more research could be done that would find that information. It just is the condition of what happens here. And this is the end of the line. There is no more line past this. Now, what do we see on the family tree is that we see a person that's his father. So what do we want to know about his father and see if what this is going on? But I'm going to emphasize again that the line ends at this guy. So when you're looking at the family tree and clicking back, and you're looking and finding an empty spot to start looking for and things like that, unless you've gone through this process of determining that there is a parent-child relationship for every single generation that gets you back to that person, then you're going to find things like this where there's nothing there and there's no way to know whether the information is correct. So let's look at Dr. John Morgan and see if there's a record in his sources that connects him to any of his children? And the answer is, what are the records that are missing? The records that are missing are any records that show children. There's a birth record for Mary Morgan, but that's not Gerard Morgan, and we don't know anything about who Mary Morgan was. But the marriage records don't have any information about the children, obviously. That they shouldn't have that record information. And when I go out and do a Google search just to see about Dr. John Morgan and who he might be, I've discover a lot of Dr. John Morgan entries. And he was a fairly prominent person, I assume. And he was a medical doctor, but he's from Philadelphia and not from Virginia, and not ultimately from Kentucky, where the rest of my Morgan family ended up. So we have this guy who was born in 1765, and the marriage was in 1765, and apparently it was just an easy person to find. And so it was just stuck in because it was somebody. So this is where this information is sitting there. Now, the question may arise immediately, which says, if you're so smart, meaning me, if I'm so smart, then why is this Dr. John Morgan still sitting in there as a father, and why haven't I detached him and left that open? Let's just call it family politics, and to be blunt, waiting for people to die off who were defending it for some reason. So once it's, we're talking about collaborative product here. So you've got to understand you're actually working with real people who have real ideas and real opinions. And it's not something that sometimes you want to get in a fight. In addition, the reason is because it's a really good, bad example. And so I've been leaving it in there so I can have at least one really bad example to use. And I may get to it sometime. So the challenge of the family tree is this. The challenge is to go back systematically on each of your own lines and verify that each person has some record showing a parent-child relationship. So we need to go back and say, does each of these people have parent-child relationships? Now, I've examined and looked at with patrons of the libraries here in BYU, and before that in Mesa, Arizona. I've probably looked at a few thousand pedigrees, and I've found that almost uniformly at some point, one of the lines or more of the lines have people strung on, sometimes for many, many, many generations after there's a situation where there's no parent-child relationship. So despite all that extra stuff, and you may think, oh, well, why would we have, won't everybody be upset if we cut this off? And that's really, basically, that's the question I have. But the other question is, until I know who his actual father is, I don't have any better information to put in than what I see on the FamilySearch family tree right now. So I'm not going to change it. If I want to do the research and I find that the information is different than what's in the family tree, then I can change that. But otherwise, I don't usually spend the time to work on lines where there's still a lot of things going on behind. Now, you might come up with the question of what records show a parent-child relationship. What are we looking for? We're not looking for simply a record called a birth certificate or a death certificate or a marriage license, because those things are relatively recent types of records. In the United States, birth records didn't become common and required kind of uniformly throughout the United States until well into the 1900s. So 1930, 40, 50, 60, before some of the states required uniform entry of birth records. This is a thing where the same problem that exists perpetually in genealogy is is using all the records that are possibly available instead of focusing on just those we call birth, marriage, death, and I would add census records. So we go way beyond those, making records. And here on the Research Wiki, the FamilySearch Research Wiki, which is on FamilySearch.org under the search tab, and it's the Research Wiki, here's Virginia's record set. And so we can see there's all these records. In blue means that there are records in that category and that they are either here on FamilySearch or they're on some other website, and that you can go to look at that information and try to find additional information on from any one of these records. And the answer to the question is any one of these records listed here could show the parent-child relationship. They could show who the parents were and who the child was. The child, of course, has to be Gerard Morgan, the first one. So this is to emphasize that. Some of them are more likely to have relationships than others, but a lot of them can have, are obvious records that would contain parent-child relationships, or possibly. So what it turns out is that building a family tree on the FamilySearch family tree is like building a house. Every part of the family tree and every part of the house is important to its structure. So you just can't randomly leave out various components of a house and expect it to stand. You're going to pay the price on that at some time. And paying the price on FamilySearch family tree is that you end up with a pet area that goes back to forever, that you somehow have to cut off because that never had anything to do with your family. So one of the things, the steps that's important in this process is that before you start to change or add any information, is you have to make sure that you have a record supporting your action. And the only way you can know what you don't, what you've already got, is to look at and read every single source. So if you've got 20 sources, you've got to go through every one of the sources and understand what it is and where it came from and why it's attached to this person. And you'll probably find that, like the bottom one here, the life and ministry of John Morgan. John Morgan is like 4 generations down from Gerard Morgan, and his life and ministry makes no mention of Gerard Morgan. So that's not a record. It's not a source. It doesn't tell any information about this person, Gerard Morgan. Other than that, somewhere down the line, there was a person named John Morgan who was part of that family. So another thing that occurs is that we need to realize that the places and that the events occurred and the dates those events are more important than finding the name. So we have to be looking at the place and the date and then finding the name, not looking for names and then trying to match places and dates to whatever turns up. And this is pretty simple. So we have back to Gerard Morgan, the 1775. And we see that he was born, this is just his vitals from FamilySearch. He was born on, supposedly here, that there's a record that says he was born on the 28th of July, 1755, and that he was born in Goochland, colony of Virginia, British Columbia, Colonia America, excuse me. And that's, yeah, okay, so that's assuming that's correct. And I would just point out that this person, Gerard Morgan, has a long history of changes on the FamilySearch family tree. The original information came from FamilySearch through the original program new.familysearch.org and from all the records that they used to create the FamilySearch family tree, the ancestral file, the International Genealogical Index, the pedigree resource file, the temple records from the church, and the membership records from the church, all those 5 record sets that went into this. So other than creating a huge number of duplicates, that kind of information was sometimes contradictory and not too accurate. So the first thing you can do is examine the places by using Google search. And you can search the places to find out what happened to at the time of the places. And you can also get them on a map. So let's look and see what that happens. So if I look up Goochland County, which is a county in Virginia, and I find out that it was founded in 1728. Okay, so technically, Gerard Morgan, who was supposedly born in 1755, could have been born in Goochland County, that it existed. That, in other words, you could find the opposite, that the information that is shown, the county does not exist. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So this is, the question is comparing those dates. 1728, yes. Birth in 1755, possible. Okay, so that's the answer. So now we go to where that information came from. And this is the supporting information. It's Presbyterian church records. And so we could go into those records and verify that that was the information that was correct. And then here's kind of a printout from images section. FamilySearch has 5 different places, by the way, to look up records. And I can't get into that today, but the 2 main ones are the catalog, the record, well, the 3 main ones, the record, historical records, the catalog, and images. And images has information that is more up to date. The catalog itself on FamilySearch.org has not been updated for 2 years. So it's 2 years behind right now. So there are now more places to search. So what we had from before, in other words, what we inherited through the channel of the creation of the FamilySearch family tree, those people back then that put that information in had what they had. Now we have a lot more. So we may be able to find more specific information, including who is the actual parent. So let's look at this just from the standpoint of what's presently in the FamilySearch family tree. And look at the dates and the places. Okay, so if we look carefully, we can see that Gerard Morgan was born on 28th of July, 1755 in Goochland, Goochland. Okay. But look over there on the record. We have a marriage on the 28th of July, 1755 in Cumberland County, Virginia. Now, there's one rule, the initial rule, the first rule of genealogy is that when the baby was born, the mother was there, meaning the mother was physically present. So how was this mother, Mary Woodson, she was quite a lady, she was able to have a baby on the 28th of July and then make it up across a whole county to the next county up and get married, or the other way around. She got married and then she ran down to Goochland Colony. And this is 1755. And the question is, did she ride a horse? Did she run and walk? Did she have a wagon? Because it's slower than a horse. How did she get there? So probably there's something basically wrong here between these 2 records. So on that basis alone, we probably can dismiss the Dr. John Morgan if he were married on that date. Let's look at Dr. John Morgan. There's a marriage record and a source attached to John Morgan. But basically that Cumberland, Virginia marriage of Mary Rogers took place in November. So this is a marriage that's quite a few months after the baby was born in another county. Is it possible? Yes, it's humanly and probably physically possible. But how likely would that be that that occurred in 1755? And we have a document showing that this John Mortgage marriage. But the problem here is this is the real problem. There's no definite definition here that this person was a doctor. So where did the doctor come from? And how did they get the doctor? So Cumberland, Virginia. So let's just kind of look just for fun, actually not for fun, routinely looking at every single place and every single sequential place in any of these entries on the map. I always put them on the map. That is just kind of the rule. First rule, read all the sources. Second rule, see if any of it makes sense. Third rule, put it all on the map and see if the map makes any sense. So this is 29 miles on foot, or in a wagon, it would take about the same period of time. They're not much faster. And how long would it take someone in the mid 1700s, when there probably were not roads, to go from Goochland County down to Cumberland County? Say it's 30 miles. Walking 20 miles a day, you might be able to get there in 2. If she was expecting a child or just had a baby, she's unlikely that she's going to be walking 20 miles a day or any kind of length of time. And why was she traveling up to Goochland County to get married if she was having a baby? So we're just, we're kind of getting to the point where we can see as we look at these records that they are not very consistent. Another step in the process is to determine when all these places existed. When were they created? Okay, so I'm looking at what's called the Atlas of Historical County Boundaries. It's from the Newberry Library. It's a list of all the counties and all their major changes. So anytime a county changed, the Atlas of Historical County Boundaries has a detailed record with all the sources, meaning it goes into all the official records on the boundary changes. Once they say something happened, that's usually conclusive. So here we have Cumberland County. It was created in 1749 and Goochland in 1728. Both of them sort of fit with as being in existence, and so that's possible. So it could be different. They could have been not created, in which case, where in the world they get the entries. So let's think about what's happening with the entries here. So we're looking at what's now an end of line. First of all, the places and dates are confused, to say, to give a little, to be at least polite on it. So there's nothing there that we can really believe, and the absence of a parent-child relationship record is conclusive at this point that even if that person's John Morgan was Gerard Morgan's father, which with the marriage date probably is not possible, then obviously we're looking for someone else. So then we're going to check the reliability of the sources for the dates the counties were incorporated, giving some guidance. Okay, so dates are important because dates give you some idea of the actual county or city or state or province or whatever, where the records could be kept, what kinds of records you'd be looking for. All of that information is based on understanding that the relationship between the physical counties on the ground and the dates and times that took care of when they were created and when they began to be modified. And we have to look at these entries, but on the process that there still are no records showing a definite parent-child relationship. Now I have to go back and mention this, and that is that these records have been compiled for over the last 100 years. And it's in 100 years, no one's found a record that shows who Gerard Morgan's parents are. So that's an interesting in itself. So when you're doing that, when you start adding generations without having the substantial source, parent-child source, you're just building a family tree in the air. You're just left reality and you're floating out there in space. Maybe interesting information, but nothing that would be at all, helpful to a genealogist who wants to look at what's going. Now, just for interest's sake, this particular line from Dr. John Morgan goes back to Sir Morgan ap Llewellyn, born in 1330. And this is in Wales, where Morgan is a predominant name. And as a matter of fact, Morgan is the 57th most common surname in the United States. So it's a fairly common surname. And you can see down there at the bottom, and if I do a search for Wales records in Wales on Find My Past, there are well over 1 million records with the name Morgan, with the surname Morgan. And John, on the other hand, is one of the top given names anywhere in the English-speaking world. So basically, we're looking at a very, very common name. And to assume that just because you find this record in 1755 in Pennsylvania, that it's somehow connected to a 1755 person that was born in Goochland, Virginia, doesn't make any sense at all. So here's a summary of how this works as we're going through with the FamilySearch family tree. First of all, you start out focusing on places, not names, not dates, not what you heard from your grandmother, whatever. You need to know what the date was. The simple rule is that we record the date as it was at the time the event occurred. So we're not just throwing out a date. And if I throw out that your ancestor was born in 1775 or 1755 like this, and he was born in the United States of America, then we could say probably not, because the United States of America didn't exist, and so forth, going back in time. So the events need to be focused on the place the events occurred. And then the second step, of course, is that you use a valid historical source, meaning records, to find a parent-child relationship for all the individuals and all the families. So if you have 6 children, you're going to have to come up with records to show that all 6 children were really part of that family. Now, there could be lots of different kinds of records. You're not really limited in the kinds of records you can use to show that. Wills and probates and land and property records and everything else out there are records that can show parent-child relationships. So, and wills are excellent, and they're really good. If anybody had come up with a will for a parent of Gerard Morgan, then maybe we would have that solved already here. And then when you've got the places sorted out and you know the place where this event occurred, then you can also focus on the dates that the events happened. Okay, so what were the circumstances that occurred, and the places as they're officially or they're governmentally constituted evolve over time. New counties were created, old counties went away. You have new towns being built, you have towns being abandoned, you have lots of things. So there's lots of these events in history that have to be date attached so that they can be substantiated as to what's actually happening. So then, as you're going along, you record every one of the places you've looked and found any information in the source tab. Now, what if you find 5 records showing his birth, 20 records showing where they lived? Fine, put them all in. The more, the merrier. There is no reason to suspect that you're certainly doing something wrong to add in as many different records as you can possibly find about the family. may be that one more record that breaks into the process and shows who this person's parents really were. So that as time goes by and as people gather records. So the worst thing that's happening on the FamilySearch family tree right now is that people are making changes without any substantiation, without any sources. So they're coming in and changing information simply because that's what they have in their records, and they're not citing any sources. And that basically is just like graffiti. It has no basis for the change. And it requires somebody like me or my family or those who are involved to go in and change it back and correct the addition that was incorrectly added. Then you think through the whole process. You realize that this is a process that involves place and that involves time and events, and that it is always the same. There's absolutely the same process that occurs time after time after time. So as you do that, it'll become a habit. You'll just automatically go, wait a minute, let me check the places here. I don't know if that's going to work. Let me go check the dates. I don't know if that's going to work, and so forth. So now you can work back systematically and don't skip generations. That's just absolutely crazy. And if this lady shown here jumping is in real life, she's going to fall down that deep crack because she is not going to hit anything she can land on. But anyway, this is probably AI generated or something. Now, kind of an admonition, don't copy pedigrees out of books that have no citations to records. Just because it's in a book doesn't mean the book is not the source. The information had to come someplace. The people who gathered the information had to obtain that either from people that were living at the time the book was created or from other records. So it's a good thing to avoid that. And it's also a good thing to avoid any AI that doesn't have sources for its information. If you get any kind of a factual thing that says this is something happened at this point, and the AI program does not give you a source for that information, you can assume it's wrong. And you may be right, but you better assume it's wrong. That's the best way to do it. Thanks for watching.
James,
Yep.
somebody has a question. Can a memory act as a source? And I'm assuming Tom is speaking about a personal memory. Something.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. But just tell us that's what it was. In other words, you can put down anything you want. I mean, you can put anything in. It's just tell us that it's a memory. And then we know that we should try to find a source, another source to verify that. But if you don't put anything in, if you don't tell us where you got the information, then we have to automatically assume it's wrong. You know, your memory might be very correct. So that's fine. It's just the oral histories, everything, all that is part of the source, and that may be the only information we have. But we need to know where we got it and how it was obtained.